Hey, City of the Future listeners. Just wanted to let you know that this is actually the season 2 finale. So if you want to hear more about what's coming up next for us, then stay tuned until the end of this episode.
Last March, our Toronto headquarters held a winter warmer outside.
Well, look at this little cafe.
Yeah, nothing like sitting up a sidewalk cafe in the middle of a snowstorm, right?
That's right.
Vanessa was there to see a prototype we've been working on with the architects at Partisans and the engineers at the firm RWDI. We call it the building raincoat.
It's like this big, plasticky thing that it comes out, and it's like... You know what? I'm going to ask some of the people around here to give me a hand describing this thing. What does this thing look like?
A sexy, transparent tent.
A canopy kind of idea, right?
It's kind of like if you took an umbrella and you propped it against your apartment building.
It looks like an igloo, sort of, you know?
Oh, that's a good one.
It looks like drapes. It looks like plastic drapes.
Clean and pleasant. It doesn't take away from the environment that's outside of it. You know, I can still look onto the street. I think something like this would usually obstruct the view, but it doesn't.
It looks like if there's a mutation of spiders and they decide to build a crazy web and take over, this is what they would build.
I see.
There's a couple of kind of larger steel beams that are coming off of the building, and that's framing out what's holding this translucent material. It's hard to describe. It's not something we've really made before.
That last voice is Jesse Shapens, the director of Public Realm at Sidewalk Labs. And as Jesse explained, the building raincoat is a see-through structure that attaches to the side of a building, creating a covered outdoor space.
So instead of just the traditional relationship between the building and the street, where you have a very strict building wall, all your climatized indoor space, and then you've got your kind of cold street on the outside, create this sort of in-between space that can be comfortable more times of the year. The thought here isn't let's try to recreate the inside of a building. The idea is actually manage some of the elements that are most likely to make you cold and uncomfortable, which is in particular wind and precipitation. In this case now, today, it's blocking the snow, so it allows you to be here and be comfortable and not have any of those elements impeding your experience. The shape of it and sort of the overall approach to building this came out of a different way of thinking about the design process.
To understand what the heck a microclimate is, I went looking for Gonzalo Pedro, the technical director at RWDI, who helped us conduct these microclimate analyses.
Microclimate simply refers to the climate or wind conditions and solar conditions in a specific area.
Can a microclimate be like a city block? Could it be an entire neighborhood? Is it flexible in that way?
It is. There's no specific limit when we discuss microclimate. You can think about microclimates within a whole city or a whole neighborhood. But generally speaking, we're talking about areas that are 10 to a couple hundred meters. Microclimate changes significantly as you move from one street to another. When we talk about altering the microclimate, we're talking about how can we use buildings, how can we use systems to manipulate wind and sun to really improve quality of life and outdoor comfort for people. And what the raincoat gives us is this transition space, which is neither an indoor space, neither an outdoor space. And that opens up a lot of possibilities.
Do you think that an architect would be a bit upset that you're essentially obscuring the side of their creation with this?
Well, I'm hoping they would view this as an extension of their creation.
Yeah.
And the idea would be to integrate this very closely to the aesthetics of the building, the design and performance of the building, and hopefully you'll start to see them being rolled out in a lot more designs.
And you keep saying roll out. Is it literally brah, rolling it out? Or?
Why not? Why not? Maybe we can create a system that is so easy to apply and remove that potentially it's fully adaptable. Maybe we can fully remove it when we don't want it and store it somewhere and then bring it back. We actually hope it would be less reactive and more proactive. And that's quite exciting.
After the winter warmer ended, I asked Jesse to help me understand how the building raincoat could be more proactive in the future.
So the idea would be that you can have a real-time understanding of the weather patterns in any given microclimate. We all have apps on our phone that tell us the weather that is happening around us. Imagine that same weather data could be connected to architecture itself. So you could have kinetic systems that can anticipate and understand when something might be changing, for example, when a rainstorm might be coming, and then actually expand and, for example, inflate a structure such that it can provide protection.
So the architecture itself can kind of anticipate our needs and react to them.
Yeah, I love that idea of sort of an anticipatory architecture. Technology can play a role in that, and it can help connection to what changes in the environment might be taking place, whether that's weather or otherwise.
Or us.
Welcome to City of the Future, a podcast from Sidewalk Labs.
Each episode, we explore ideas and innovations that could transform cities. We're your hosts. I'm Vanessa Quirk.
And I'm Eric Jaffe.
In this episode, we're exploring an idea that could make our cities adapt not only to nature, but to us, too.
Responsive architecture. For as long as humans have existed, we've explored ways to shelter ourselves from the elements.
This need for shelter is what defined architecture for centuries. But in the 1900s, architecture took a turn. Here's Jesse again.
So as modern technologies became more and more embedded in architecture, what started to happen, and it was especially technologies like air conditioning, is that we started to design our buildings and our cities in a way that was divorced from the environment. And we started to make sort of sealed, hermetic structures that were entirely conditioned, that were separate from the environment outside.
Modernist architects aspired to create big, beautiful monuments with clean, sharp lines. They started using materials like concrete, glass, and steel.
Our traditional forms of building structures, by and large, it's sort of you build the building wall and you build the various, systems, and these things don't move and they don't change. They don't have an inherent capability to respond.
But as the style became mainstream, certain architects began to buck the trend. They started to imagine a different kind of architecture, one that could be lighted on the land, that could move or change or evolve over time.
In the U.S., Buckminster Fuller designed geodesic domes that used fewer materials and worked with nature rather than against it. In the UK, the British collective Archigram imagined entire cities that could pick themselves up and move.
Another visionary of adaptable architecture from this time was Cedric Price.
The incompleteness of initial concept, the difficulty is keeping that incompleteness throughout the system.
His most famous commission was the Fun Palace, a kind of theater, but instead of plays, it would showcase people. Price called it an anti-building. It would constantly be active and changing, a laboratory of fun.
Okay, well, can you tell me what this place looked like?
So Price's diagrams of Fun Palace don't actually show a building per se. There's no walls, no roof. Instead, it's like a series of columns made of scaffolding, basically. And nearby, there's this large gantry crane that moves around and picks up walls or stages and stairs and just moves them around.
If you stack boxes together, what you are wasting is the opportunity of the client and the user at some date when you won't be around to say, Christ, we never wanted that middle box.
Price believed that the Fun Palace would actually break open architecture and make it more accessible for anyone and everyone to participate in.
All right, well, you made me participate in immersive retail theater. Can we go to this Fun Palace?
You want to participate in the fun of the Fun Palace?
Exactly.
Well, maybe not surprisingly, the Fun Palace was never built. And that's true of a lot of these kind of visionary works of this time. But nevertheless, they were massively influential, especially for these younger radical architects of the 1960s. But these young radical architects, they had something that previous generations didn't. They had access to a material that was cheap, light, and malleable. And it was exactly what they needed to start bringing some of these big ideas to life.
Because of the availability of plastic and the cheapness, the affordability of it, it meant that architecture was much more accessible.
That's Sharon Francis, the author of Bubbletecture, an art book from Phaidon that showcases all the unconventional, futuristic furniture, clothes, buildings that emerged from this new material. Bubbletecture also chronicles the rise of inflatable architecture.
In the 1950s, Frank Lloyd Wright started experimenting with inflatable houses. But Bubbletecture didn't really take off until the 1960s.
The lightweight, flexible, instantaneous nature of inflatables provided a dichotomy against the prevailing brutalist, modernist architectural paradigm that was of that time.
By the early 1970s, unconventional inflatables started bubbling up around the world. One of the first was the Clean Air Pod by a collective called Ant Farm.
It was basically a giant bubble that invited people in where they could breathe clean air.
Removes all the XYZ axes of space, and it begins to give somebody a feeling that there's other spaces they can be in.
And the folks behind Ant Farm didn't just create the inflatables, they preached the bubble gospel.
Rectangular rooms have to do with rectangular limits.
They actually created a book that they called the Inflato Cookbook, which was an illustrated guide to making your own inflatables. So, they sort of expounded that for the masses.
In 1971, the Austrian group Coop Himmelblau put people in bubbles and set them loose upon the streets of Basel, Switzerland.
Around the same time, a Dutch collective called Spatial Effects tried something very similar, except they put their bubbles on water.
So while some radicals were interested in bubbles because they could seal people off from the world, others wanted to use bubbles to interact with the environment in new ways.
Yeah. And in Sharon's book, you can see that most of today's radicals are much more interested in that latter category.
Now, bubbles are created in which many, many people can be interacting within them. Technology has evolved where things have the capacity to be more responsive.
Today, idealistic architects don't just have plastic to bring these creations to life. They have ETFE.
Ethylene tetrafluoroethylene.
Yeah. Oh, that's what the building raincoat is made of, right? So what's different about ETFE from just regular plastic?
It's a fluorine-based plastic, so it's highly durable. It's also transparent. It's about 1/100th of the weight of glass. So the lightweightness gives so much more versatility, possibilities, flexibility. It's also highly wind resistant in that because it has flex, it can buckle under wind pressure and not break.
When ETFE was introduced in the early 2000s, most people used it as a way to create large, lightweight enclosures like stadiums.
But soon after, architects started experimenting with the material. And one of the most interesting projects was built in 2011.
Okay, so I'm looking at a picture of the Media ICT building in Barcelona, and it's got a bunch of kind of geometric shapes, and some of the geometric shapes must be the ETFE because they look kind of pillowy and shiny like a plastic.
It's equipped with temperature sensors, so they collect information from the external environment to adjust the internal environment through the ETFE panels. And also in summer and winter, the internal of the panel is allowed to be filled with like a nitrogen-based fog that creates like a shading to the facade. They became sort of intelligent pillows in a way, and that then they were used in an automated way to control how the building worked and functioned.
So this is very similar to what the building raincoat aspires to do.
Right. The ICT building uses sensors to respond to its environment. And then the intelligent ETFE pillows, they can create shading on a hot day.
And this kind of responsiveness is just the beginning. Architects and scientists today are discovering new materials like ETFE and combining them with new construction systems, which means we're beginning to develop buildings that can expand or contract and can even be digitally controlled.
Sharon thinks that these innovations will transform our physical environment.
It's about having flexibility and adaptability, and I think we can extend that to the bigger physical environment and the possibilities for responsiveness and change and flexibility and adaptability and all those sort of aspirations.
There is an existing building that's already moving the needle toward this future.
It's a building that represents an important step in the evolution of responsive architecture, a new cultural institution in New York City, and we can see it from our office window. So we're looking at the shed from the 27th floor of our office, and it's like a very funky, bubbly looking building. It's kind of got like a glass bottom, but it's surrounded by this pillowy ETFE.
It does have a little
shell.
greenhouse feel, yes.
Yeah, kind of like a plastic greenhouse a little bit, but in a fancy kind of way.
Right, but when you're walking in from the ground floor, Vanessa, you don't get this whole vantage point. I mean, we can really see the mechanics behind how this thing works. There's tracks that connect the shed itself to the rest of the building, and that helps it retract.
Right. This is what is so unique about this building. Like, yes, it looks distinct because of the ETFE pillows, but what's really unusual about it is the way that it can move and adapt according to the needs of the space.
When the project began, the question was, what does a cultural facility look like in the 21st century and beyond?
That's Liz Diller, one of the architects who designed the shed. We met up with her at the offices of Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro to learn how this unusual building came to be.
Just plunking a building on the ground, freestanding, is kind of, it's a suburban idea, right? As responsible urbanists, we're at least thinking about what's the left of us, to the right of us, above us, below us, and making something that's part of an urban fabric, and it's part of city making. The shed sits on sovereign New York City land. The city marked it out as a cultural facility, but only 21,000 square feet of it initially. And when we stepped into this project, thinking about it from scratch, we thought, well, 21,000 feet, even if we build vertically in that site, is not quite enough space. And there is an open space next to us that we felt could be used for a flexible building.
So Liz and her team came up with a pretty ingenious solution, inspired by how a matchbox opens and closes. So the shed is surrounded by a lightweight ETFE shell, and that actually extends out on those tracks that we saw out the window. The whole shell just comes out like the sleeve of a matchbox.
It telescopes out from over the fixed building and expands the footprint. The way that the technology works, it takes 5 minutes and the horsepower of one Prius engine to deploy the shell of the shed. That slip sleeve produces a very, very large space that it encloses as a space for large installations, large performances and theatrical events, and all sorts of events. So it effectively doubles the floor plate, and you could have an open outdoor space that's devoted to cultural use as well.
ETFE has never been used in this way before, and Liz thinks that with this new material, architecture can achieve a whole new level of flexibility.
Flexibility that will allow our buildings to keep up with our fast-moving world.
Our culture is moving so fast, right? Economically, technologically, politically, socially, we're advancing so fast that buildings actually can't keep up with the rate of change of our culture. And buildings are inherently slow. They're expensive, they're static, they're usually inert. You try to get it right for the future, and there you have it. And then if you're really lucky, the building is retained 30 or 40 years later, and it still has a relevance, and it could be transformed a bit. I think that the buildings that don't survive are the ones that are so fixed that a new program can't possibly be imagined in it. So I think the charge for architects today is to imagine an architecture that is flexible and supple, but usually that word flexibility is equated with the generic, right? So we think of loft space as flexible. We think about open plate office space as flexible. The fewer columns, the better. But the idea here, and I think for the shed, is to actually make an argument for an architecture of distinction that still has flexibility. So the Bilbao effect of making an iconic fixed building that is just like going to be there forever and it's a symbol, it's a little bit of a dinosaur today. But I think the shed is putting a line in the sand.
In many of the interviews that Liz has done, she's mentioned that a key influence for the shed's adaptable, flexible design was Cedric Price, the architect of the Fun Palace that I mentioned earlier. So I had to ask, what do you think Cedric Price would think of it?
I hope he'd be jealous.
Okay.
I spoke with his widow, and she, she said that he would be delighted at this, and probably this would have been like a Fun Palace 2.0, and he probably would have gotten there way before we got there, because he was really so pioneering and a great visionary, and a lot of his ideas have come to be.
But there's an aspect of the shed that is uniquely of our time. Liz calls it publicness.
Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro has designed dozens of beautiful buildings around the world. But the project that they're best known for is the High Line. And what makes the High Line so special is that, like the shed, it gives back to the public realm.
Well, first of all, we often think about what accounts for the success of the High Line. Why do people love it so much? And I think that they love it because there's a need for publicness. There's a true need. We live in our office space. We're like constantly being productive. Our lives as urban dwellers, we're constantly working. When we're not in our offices working or our studios working, we're working on our mobile devices, or we're shopping and spending money.
She's tapping her laptop right now.
That I cannot be separated from. But meanwhile, there's still a fundamental need for public space, real physical publicness, sharing space and time together collectively. We do a lot of urban buildings, and for us, that interface between the municipal street and the program inside, which is typically either a private program or it's a private-public program like a museum, which has guards and closing hours. To make that interface soft and thick is something that we're very interested in. In a rapidly privatized world that we're living in, right? Our cities are just getting sucked up by developers. We need to protect public space. It's fundamental.
I mean, what Liz is saying here is really important. Cities need to protect public space. But what's so interesting to me about what she's talking about is that responsive architecture could actually help cities not just protect public space, but actually expand it.
Yeah, I mean, really like the shed does. I mean, we can design the capacity for publicness into buildings themselves now. And then the boundaries between buildings and public spaces, between inside and outside, they essentially dissolve.
And when you can dissolve those boundaries, then the buildings themselves actually become more accessible and even democratic.
Right, and that really is the goal. And it's something that Jesse, our director of Public Realm, is thinking about a lot.
I'm interested in how, in particular, these temporary structures can be almost tools that are given to the community. And how do you make it possible for many more people, in a way, almost to practice architecture? Today, it can be quite a high barrier for somebody to create a structure. Can it be possible for the city to provide more architecture that is at the hands of the individuals and of the community itself?
So can you give us an example of how that could work? Like, you gave us the great example of the building raincoat earlier, where, on a snowy day, it can kind of anticipate the snow and deploy. But what's an example of a structure, like a temporary structure, that could respond to something that you or I or a community needs?
Yeah. You and I might have this idea that next weekend we'd like to have a little art installation, but we think that doing something out in the square that actually is able to bring people together, maybe it's actually around sound and listening in a public space, and we need that enclosure. Instead of ourselves having to go figure out how to solve that problem of how do you inflate a structure, how do you make it work in a space, and how do we get a permit for something like that, there's just built into the park a library of structures we can check out, and we can have it set up, and we can go and we can do our thing, and we can have that in the park and in the plaza, and everybody can come and listen and participate in that listening event and installation that we've envisioned.
It feels to me a lot like kind of the next evolution of the shed, in the sense that if the shed has been created and designed to provide more publicness that people can use, the next stage of that, as you're kind of describing, is almost one step further in the democratization process, where the public itself can create the structures, right?
Exactly. And I think digital technology has a real role to play in helping to create more democratic access to tools and spaces. So right now, what spaces might be available for use is sort of opaque. One of the things we've seen increasingly within libraries that's been very powerful is simply using technology to make it available for people to book spaces so that you can get your friends together and have like a board game night in the library.
So then I think that there's an important distinction here from the way that, we think about the digital layer for things like climate versus things like community, because when it comes to climate, sure, the architecture can be anticipatory. That makes sense. But when it comes to encouraging a sense of community and interaction, then, you don't really need the tech to anticipate that. You just want it to facilitate community, make it easier and more part of our everyday life.
Yeah, I'm personally not excited about a future where everything is entirely anticipated and that there's algorithms that are imagining what my needs are. I want to have the agency myself to also shape and decide and determine what I want to do in a space and how that space might be able to support me and my community. The role that technology around these sides of the equation can play is how does it provide that agency over the environment, and then you imbue the environment with the capabilities to be responsive and allow for that agency to have effect, such that I can actually have more control over my environment because I know more about the opportunities that exist. It's a spectrum of spaces that are accessible to me is greater, and the spectrum of tools and technologies that I have to shape my environment is greater. It's not being decided for me.
Right, and I imagine in that scenario, if I'm thinking as a city resident, you just feel like you have so much more of a sense of really ownership over the public spaces around you.
Yeah, we did a research study around sort of what creates senses of belonging for people in public space. The insights are probably applicable to people anywhere, and I think probably the most significant and consistent insight from people of all different incomes and backgrounds in different parts of the city was simply that sense of ownership and belonging comes from an actual real experience of agency. When you see a place where people, individuals, have shaped the environment, where they have changed the facades, where they've actually made choices that you see are sort of reflective of them as people, those are the places that people also feel the most invited and welcomed to be a part of, because they see there's other people that have left a mark. I can leave a mark too. That's actually what creates a sense of belonging.
Thank you for listening to City of the Future, a podcast from Sidewalk Labs. Your hosts are Vanessa Quirk and me, Eric Jaffe. We are produced by Benjamin Walker and Andrew Callaway.
Mixed by Zach Mcnees. Special thanks for this episode go to Gonzalo Pedro, Jesse Shapens, Sharon Francis, Liz Diller, Christine Noblejas, and all the Winter Warmer volunteers and attendees who stood outside in a snowstorm to talk to us about the building raincoat. Thank you.
Art is by the great Tim Cow. And one important note is that all the illustrations for Season 2 that Tim used to create the episode art were done by the very talented Emily Taylor. Our music is composed by Adaam James Levin-Areddy. If you want to hear more of Adaam's work, you can check out his band, Lost Amsterdam, at amsterdamlost.com.
Like I mentioned, this is the last episode of Season 2, so if you liked it, then please give us a review or share it with your friends. It would really help other people discover this podcast.
And in between now and Season 3, if you want to keep following what we're doing, subscribe to the Sidewalk Labs newsletter at the bottom of our website.
Eric and I religiously create that newsletter every week.
Mostly Vanessa.
And then the other thing that I'll be trying to do is post on Instagram. So you can follow us at City of the Future Podcast, and maybe I'll put some behind-the-scenes content there.
And you can always drop us a line or tell us what's exciting you about the future by emailing podcast@sidewalklabs.com.
So until next time.
See you in the future.